Welcome to Passages. I'm your host, Michael Chighel. When the Israelites leave Egypt, not long after they leave, they encounter in the desert a group of people known as Amalek. Actually, Amalek comes and storms them, takes them by storm, and Israel has to engage in its first battle. The battle, well, I won't tell you what happens in that battle, but the war certainly continues beyond that battle for many generations, and it's not even clear whether the war is finished even today. Join me in the discussion of Amalek with my two guests, Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz from Or Sameach and Dr. Elliot Malamut from the Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto. Join us. Who is Amalek? For one, is Amalek a person?
Amalek was a person. He was actually the grandson of Esav was named Amalek, and according to rabbinic Bible interpretation, this nation is a nation comprised of his descendants.
I mean, one of the fascinations of Amalek really is that he was a person at one time, was a tribe, and has been perpetuated throughout history as something beyond a person, as a kind of myth, as a kind of anti-Semitic prototype, and that prototype has been played with. People are comfortable with it, uncomfortable with it, and has, if you look even in the literature following the Holocaust, has sort of resurrected again often as Hitler's Amalek, prototype of evil. Problem is that once a person stops being a person, in other words, is dead, is long gone, and you only have myth to deal with, how do you deal with myth? And so understandings of what Amalek, how Amalek should be treated, for instance, have undergone a radical revolution since the Bible.
So you think that the myth doesn't do justice to the reality, necessarily?
Nobody knows what the reality is, but that's of course the whole point of Scripture, is that everybody starts reading into it what the reality of the person is. Nobody knows Amalek. We just know an action that Amalek took, which was to pounce on the Jewish people in their weakest moment.
Do you agree with this dilution?
Well, I certainly agree with the fact that that does happen in Bible interpretation, and it has happened in the case of Amalek. Whether it's correct or not, I don't know. I think there might be a danger in pointing to every anti-Semite and saying, oh, this person is Amalek.
Absolutely.
Because, number one, you begin to blur the distinctions between various types of anti-Semitism and how they have to be dealt with. But also, you almost legitimize anti-Semitism. The fact that Amalek is the perpetual archenemy of the Jewish people is something which the Bible foretells. So by saying, oh, this person is Amalek, that's to be expected. This group is Amalek, that's to be expected. This group is Amalek, that's to be expected. You're almost legitimizing anti-Semitism. You're certainly not going to work at building bridges, because the Torah's solution to the problem of Amalek is annihilation. And if we ever reach the point where we say that is the solution to all forms of anti-Semitism, I think we're going to be making a mistake.
So how do you see this type of anti-Semitism? What is the type
that's
represented by Amalek?
That's a good question. I think in the classic literature over the centuries, Amalek is really fighting an ideological battle. It's not a racial division. It's not a territorial battle, because we're dealing with ideologies. And again, in mystical literature, we're talking about really a war against God, against the belief that divinity enters the world, which is very, very different than many of the forms of modern anti-Semitism.
Do you think this is borne out by the text?
That's a very good question.
The war against God is borne out against the text in the original story. I just want to return for a moment to the idea of legitimizing Amalek, the anti-Semite. See, I think that's not an accident. I think, of course, what Jews have done and continue to do, and do it especially now, is to focus excessively, obsessively on the anti-Semite, because it's a way of, in the worst case scenario, substituting for their own relationship to their Jewishness. So the anti-Semite, the other, Sartre's idea of who the Jew is, becomes defined by the other, the anti-Semite. And when you have that, when you have an identity by negation, I am this person that others don't like, you have a lot of trouble, right? So I think in a way it's a very unhealthy thing for Jews to overly be preoccupied with the whole Amalekite myth.
Look, witness the obsession with Holocaust memorials.
Right.
really is exactly that issue. It's almost that anti-Semitism is the defining characteristic of Judaism in popular life.
It's a weird type of idolatry, perhaps. I mean, idolatry is the wrong word, but insofar as idolatry and obsession have a certain similarity, I mean, to structure Judaism around the idol of the anti-Semite, as it were, in a weird way.
Quite so,
Yeah.
quite so. I mean, the other thing is, of course, what to do with this anti-Semite. Breidowitz referred to the idea of annihilation. That's very problematic. It's very troubling. Is the real idea that we're really supposed to annihilate this person or this tribe or this archetype? And if you say, well, when you see him, well, how are you going to know it? How are you going to know him when you see him? Who's going to be the one that gets this punishment of annihilation?
In Jewish law, Maimonides already ruled that we have no way of identifying the real Amalek. Therefore, in practice, we don't wage this war.
But that's fascinating. Isn't this another way of showing that post-biblical Jewish thinkers, uncomfortable with the implications of what the Torah talks about, have to find ways to almost metaphorize it or historicize it out of existence?
What about let's get back to this idea of the identity of Amalek. What is the identity of Amalek, and what type of anti-Semitism does Amalek represent or embody?
Well, again, just to repeat what we said before, it seems that Amalek is a religious ideologue.
Right, so you mentioned what ideology?
I'll give an example. The Amalek attacks as the Jews are on their way to rendezvous with God at Mount Sinai. And that's understood as an attack on the chosenness of the Jewish people. This is their destiny. This is the point in time and place where they are going to be charged with the mission to be the chosen people and to bring the message of God to the world. And Amalek can't tolerate that. Amalek says this meeting has to be stopped at all costs. We're going to attack before they reach Mount Sinai. It seems it's an attack on the centrality of the Jewish people in Jewish thought. It's an attack on the chosenness of the Jewish people. And, of course, keep in mind that Amalek is a descendant of Esav, the twin brother of Yaakov. And we'd understand that, putting aside the ideological issues, it's simply a family rivalry, as we're talking about the twin brother who was disinherited, and his descendants claiming their birthright.
Do you think, would you narrow it down to any one of those? Do you think all of those are equal factors?
They all could be true. They're not contradictory.
Right.
Jewish exegesis really was struggling and bifurcated into many ways. What's the problem here? Right? It's not. In other words, it wasn't self-evident to the Jewish commentators exactly what did he do wrong.
Right.
So you have people who originally focused on the patent sense of the unethical here. Somebody like the Abarbanel looks at it and says, well, you don't attack. I think he says comes like a band of thieves in the night. You don't come and attack the defenseless. So that's a kind of almost a kind of secular morality. It's just not a nice thing to do, right? Whereas Nachmanides really stresses on the religious aspect. It's a war against God, right? But what's striking to me is that in both of these you have the need for justification, because the text says that God says basically we're going to blot them out. So if you look at that, you can say, well, this is a very uncomfortable thing. I'm going to blot out women and kiddies too, and the cattle and everything, and that flies in the face of the modern sensibility. And the very notion that Jewish commentators had to explain it already is saying it's not good enough for God to ask. It almost reminds you, of the classic philosophical debate, Plato and the Euthyphro, do the gods do it because it is good, or is it good because the gods do it, right? Why are we going to wipe out Amalek? Are we going to find independent rational grounds to wipe him out? Or are we going to say, well, God said to wipe him out, and that's good enough? And that idea that God said, wipe him out, that's good enough, didn't sit well. The very fact that commentary has to find ways of why do we kill him shows that we don't really sit well with that kind of annihilation. And I would say that it's actually linked to other stories in the Torah that just don't sit well with the modern Jew. What are we going to do with these calls for annihilation?
It's interesting. It's not clear from what's been said whether this is an attack on God or on the Jewish people. I mean, on the one hand, you're saying that the ideology that they're standing against, that they're opposing, is the chosenness of the Jewish people. So they're almost universalists. The very idea of chosenness is outrageous. On the other hand, they're attacking God, who is the principle of universalism. So who exactly are they attacking?
Well,
who is their victim, Israel or God?
The Jews, I believe, see as their role to develop and bring this universal message to all mankind. Attacking the Jewish people really is attacking the ultimate message. So it's not just an attack directed against a very specific group. In other words, it's an attack, I think, directed against the universal ideal. That's why it is justifiably a war against God.
It's like killing the messenger. You know, the messenger brings bad news.
Right.
So you say, I don't want to hear this news, so you kill the messenger. Sure. Kill the newscaster, because you don't want to hear about the war.
See, I think that there's a broader issue I think we have to bring up, which is, to what extent can the Torah, the Bible, be a moral guide when it advocates this type of annihilation?
Right.
You see,
would
if
you
you
call
accept
it genocide? Can we use that word?
I think,
Is genocide
I think
the
you
right
can use that word safely.
Biblically sanctioned, divinely sanctioned genocide?
Well, you see, I think that's the point. You see, if you accept the divinity of Torah, this is God's prerogative. God can make such a judgment about a people that they forfeited their right to live, so on and so forth. Once you reject the divinity of Torah, then I don't know exactly how Torah could be a moral guide in any sense. If there's an advocacy of genocide in the Torah, doesn't that put into question every other law of the Torah?
It's morally problematic, though, on both counts. Certainly, if it's not divinely written, it's almost absurd. I mean, so some ancient guy said, wipe out the Amalekites, so we're going to go to war against them. But even if God said it, it's problematic. It's problematic because it isn't God wiping them out. It's God advocating that human beings wipe them out. And human beings are bewildered and frustrated and uncertain about killing anybody, especially killing en masse and killing innocents.
Now,
so the notion of God using human beings to kill innocents is tremendously problematic.
You know, it's a very interesting thing that in the biblical account of a later battle against Amalek, King Saul, the commentators point out, the Talmud already points out,
yes,
that he was very reluctant to do this. I mean, he questioned the loss of so much innocent life. The Talmud says that a heavenly voice came out and said, don't be so pious. You know, this is what I told you to do, go ahead and do it. So it's true that this was grappled with. But I still think that if the Bible is divine, and we deal with Amalek not as an idea or a myth, as you say, but as a very specific, identifiable group, at least it can be justified, it can be understood. If God was to tell you, this group is the progenitor of Hitler and Stalin and all the aggressors, the world is better off without them than with them, that's a judgment that I think we should accept.
No. I radically disagree with that. You're not just talking about wiping out Hitler and Stalin. It's easy to look at Hitler and Stalin and wipe them out. You're talking about, the context here is the modern day German. Okay? The family with the kids living in Hamburg, and you're going up and you're saying, you guys got to go too. Okay, not just dad who fought in the war, what did daddy do, but you guys got to go too.
You're assuming that Hitler hatches from an egg.
You know,
doesn't the Hitler emerge from a nation, from a culture, from a national ideology?
So I should go up to the 2-year-old who's living in that culture and say, I'm sorry, you have to die. No. Even Jewish commentators did not sit comfortably with that.
We can't make that judgment, but if God makes that judgment, why is that objectionable?
Of course we make that judgment. God does not come down from on high throughout Jewish history and say, well, you will kill him, him, and him. It's Jews, of course, who step in, read the text, and decide, what are we going to do with this material now? Even the most traditional Jews, right? In the 19th century, when the Avnei Nezer, when Avram Bornstein is looking at this, he looks at this text and he says, but we clearly see that children are not to be put to death for the sins of the fathers, and vice versa, right? And he does not do with that text what, say, the Talmud would do with it, talk about it in a legal court context. He's talking about it as, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with the idea that children should die for their father's sins. So the idea of what to do in real life, not just as a text where it's easy to say, well, Hashem says, wipe them out, let's wipe them out, but what to do with real children in your gun sight, that makes it problematic.
Well, let me ask you a question. Could you accept the possibility that the disappearance of Amalek, the fact that they can't be identified, is an act of divine providence? Because perhaps with the passage of so many years, so many generations, maybe the original justification doesn't exist.
I could.
And therefore, hashgacha, so to speak, divine providence, has arranged things to make it legally impossible.
It would be comforting to think so.
Why doesn't God just do it? I mean, why, the problem still does remain. Why, if it is a thorn in God's side, why doesn't God take care of it? If this culture is intrinsically evil and deserves to be exterminated.
Because man has to fight evil. That's certainly a lesson.
Sure.
That man has to fight evil. Let me bring a related point. The Torah says we have to remember Amalek. And in synagogues to this very day, year after year after year, we read this section about Amalek. Now, if we wouldn't perpetuate the memory of Amalek, it certainly would have slipped into oblivion by now. I mean, among the hundreds of other small tribes that existed in that time. The only reason it's remembered is because we remember it. But if God wants us to wipe it out, why, on the other hand, does he tell us to perpetuate its memory? The answer is he doesn't want it to fade away. He wants us to blot it out. He wants us to destroy it. We can't allow evil merely to fade away. It has to be fought, it has to be destroyed.
Obviously, we're not just talking about a nice story. It's not just a narrative. When the Torah talks about something, it wants to have prescriptive value. What are we actually going to do with this person or this tribe? I would argue that they're actually not calling for the literal annihilation. That's why I think the verses are stressing the idea of remembering it through a book. That's how we fight our battles. In other words, contrary to the notion of Israel and the modern warrior, mostly speaking,
the pen is mightier than the sword.
Jewish people fight evil through ideas, right? Through inspiration, through spiritual swaying, not through literal annihilation. I don't think that it would be my contention, actually, that post-biblically that never was the meaning of the text and never would be. If that's the way God arranged things providentially, perhaps. But on the ground, it seems to me that's how we fight this war.
But I think you're treading on dangerous theological territory, because then any of the commandments could be dealt that way.
Metaphorized out of existence?
And not literally.
And it's exactly what Jewish commentators have done throughout history, is begin to take the text and do different things with them.
But they've never, within the tradition, they've never tampered with the law.
Never taken a law in the Torah and said, we don't do this anymore. Often, you know that's not true.
Often there are situations where, because of circumstances and conditions beyond our control, certain laws aren't practiced. But for example, we've never taken animal sacrifice and said this is metaphoric and not to be practiced literally, and we pray for its restoration in the Messianic age.
We have taken practices like testing the jealous husband, the sota, breaking the neck of the heifer, and we have said that social conditions have made doing these mitzvot a moot point. They've made them a non sequitur. Why is that not treading on dangerous ground? In other words, what you're really talking about, bottom line, is who you've invested your authority in, politically and spiritually, to decide the fate of Jewish law. You've basically said, I don't have any problems with Chazal saying we don't do these mitzvot anymore, right? Which is fine, that's okay, that's legitimate, but if you're going to open up that's the Pandora's box. I'm not treading on any ground that hasn't been trodden upon many times in Jewish history by people who've decided with a great deal of proactivity and said, we don't do this anymore.
But there's a big difference between saying that this is what the text means, but we are not going to observe the law, and saying this is never what the text meant in the first place.
I said post-biblically, it's problematic to say that that's what was ever intended. In other words, once the conditions in history became such that it was clear this wasn't what was going to happen, it seems to me that a lot of Jewish commentators jumped on the bandwagon, and I'll give you an example, right? Why is it that Maimonides slips in his laws regarding these matters, that we offer, when we go and we annihilate these nations, we don't just annihilate 7 nations and offer them a peace agreement, but he slips in 2 words, and Amalek. We offer them a peace agreement. What's he doing with the original text here? Is there any clue, inkling, notion, scent of the idea that we would go up to Amalek and say, well, you know what? If you'll be cool with us, we'll give peace to you. Not a whit. He goes back, takes that original text, and I would argue what he's really trying to do is say, we're not doing this. We're not going to wipe them all out. So I'm going to recontextualize these verses, which don't admit of anything.
In that instance, Maimonides does have a very legitimate source in the Talmud. The Talmud equates the war against the 7 nations occupying Israel to Amalek. The Jerusalem Talmud clearly declares, against the position of Rashi, that the terms of peace are offered to the 7 nations. And therefore, the Rambam extends that 1 inch further to Amalek as well. It isn't inconsistent.
That's a mile. That's not an inch. That's a long, long move to take people who are the prototype of evil and say, you know what? We don't have to wipe you out. If you say you're okay to live under us, we're not going to touch you. That's a movement away, a large movement away. I don't begrudge him that movement whatsoever, but it does raise the issue of what do we do with text. Amalek is no different than anything else. What do we do with these things? And here, to me, you have the crux of the modern problem, which is, on the one hand, if you literalize the texts, they come off sometimes as extremely alienating to the modern sensibility, if not plain horrifying. And if you do what a lot of liberal Judaism has done in the last 250 years, which is to nice it up, pretty it up, metaphorize it, or just throw it out, it's a very thin substitute. You still have to have Torah. You still have to have something substantial. That leaves the thinking modern person in a big pickle.
It's still horrifying, even if we do, as you want to suggest, reinterpret the incident in a post-biblical age, in a metaphorical terms. So we say we're combating evil as represented by Amalek. Still, at some point in our history, genocide, literal genocide, seems to be sanctioned and commanded. So what do we do with that? There's a question of continuity. How do we hold on to the Torah that even if at one point in history, just as some people have difficulty with Abraham sacrificing Isaac, at some point in history, although that raises different issues, but at some point in history, the God that we call God said genocide. It's got to be done. There's a time for peace and there's a time for genocide.
I like your question.
What do we do with
How
that?
do we hold on to Torah is the question.
We don't want to redact this out. I assume. We don't want to snip this out of the Torah and say, well, this is really an ugly bit. I mean, one thing it does show, at least, is that the Torah as a propaganda text is not a very successful text. It doesn't really promote us that well. It actually shows the ugly sides as well. So it's it's a reason to grasp onto its veracity, to say, well, this must be a true text.
Not necessarily, because you could always raise the counter-argument, I'm just playing devil's advocate, that it was progressive for its time. Right? The fact that it violates a modern sensitivity.
Everyone was committing genocide. And we only did it once.
Exactly.
The God of Israel only did it once, an extreme situation.
Exactly. That would undermine its value for modern man, but it would not undermine its validity in the context of its time and place. Again, as a believer, I have to say that the fact that it is divine means that God can exercise prerogatives that human beings can't, including the placing of the ban on this nation. But again, to a non-believer, I really don't know how he could take the Bible seriously.
And often they don't. And that's what happens. That's what happens to the modern person. They look at this, even to say to them, well, it was progressive for its time. That's not going to mean a great deal to the contemporary person, unless you want to argue that, look, a text has to enter history somewhere, somehow. God has to kick a hole through history and enter into it somewhere. So this is the attempt. And that's lucid as far as it goes, but eventually you do reach the point of the modern age where the contemporary person says, okay, may have been wonderful once, I even grant you that, but what am I to make of this? And Amalek is not the only example of the problematic text. You named one, the Akedah. At the end of the book of Numbers, Sefer Bamidbar, you have the war against the Midianites, which has a certain parallel feeling of wiping out women and children and so forth. So there are enough problematic texts morally to leave a person scratching their head, which we do, and we try and grapple with them.
Let's talk about the theatrics of the text, because it's a wonderfully theatrical text with Moses there sitting on top of the mountain as the battle begins, and he has his arms raised, and so long as his arms are raised, the battle is in favor of Israel, and then when his arms fall down, Amalek wins, and then they get two people to prop up his arms. I mean, it's substance for good comedy, I should think. Hur on one side and Aaron on the other side, holding up his arms. What are we to make of these theatrics? Why is it? What's Moses' role in the war? I mean, he's not out there wielding a sword like Joshua.
Well, Moses is praying, and raising hands was the traditional posture of prayer. Obviously, Moses could have prayed with his hands lowered as well, and even when he lowered his hands, the earlier prayers were still in force. but this was a symbolic reminder to the Jewish people that their victory was through his prayer. This was driven home in a very dramatic way, according to the text, that when Moses would lower his hands, all of a sudden the battle would turn. And I think it's important, just at this juncture, if we accept the mystical interpretation that the ideology of Amalek is in battle against God, against divinity, against perhaps even divine providence and involvement in the world, then the issue of prayer becomes very, very central, because if God is removed from the world, obviously prayer is meaningless. Prayer has no benefit. It can't help. So, when you wage a war against an enemy, it's not only the weapons and the relative strengths of the armies. You're dealing with the power of the ideologies, of the ideas. And God wants to demonstrate in the course of the battle the ideology that the Jews bring to the battleground, which is divine providence, involvement, and thus the power of prayer.
Would you say then that it's not the prayer as such that is winning the war, but their confidence in the prayer? In other words, if it's just Moses' prayer that's really determining it, then why do they need warriors altogether?
Well, that's what the rabbis say.
Moses is waging the war, and the other guys are just,
The rabbis say that. The rabbis say it wasn't the prayer of Moses per se, but it was when the Jews saw the hands of Moses raised, and they, in a sense, subserviated themselves to their Father in heaven. So that's when the battle turned. Because it was really their belief in prayer, not as much as the substance of the prayer itself.
Which is really a fascinating evolution of just how Judaism grows. You look at the original text, and there is this kind of slightly operatic feel, Moses raising his arms and lowering his arms, and that's how the battle goes. But the rabbis do something very sophisticated with that text in the Mishnah. Right? They're talking about how belief that things can work is part of the battle, and when you jump ahead further into Jewish history, into the 19th century, where you have the Hasidic movement looking at the text. And the Hasidim basically looked at Amalek as the enemy within, speaking of another way of radically metaphorizing the text. So if this is the enemy within, and you're supposed to go out and fight that enemy, right? It says, see what Amalek did to you. And many of the Hasidim jump on that word you and say, it's talking about you. It's not talking about some, long dead person in history. It's talking about you every day are fighting this battle against the evil within. So then this story about Moses raising and lowering the arms becomes of paramount significance. Do you believe, first of all, how do you think about your battles in daily life? Who's on your side? How do you win them? This is the stuff of stock spiritual significance, and something that I think we actually downplay a little bit in Judaism. Yeah. We're a little bit embarrassed about that straight spiritual energy. Where do you get your energy from? Is God helping you? Does prayer work? Etc.
You see, but the point you're raising is a very interesting point, because Maimonides, for example, believed free will was an absolute. A person's spiritual struggle is totally in his own hands. And this really was an innovation of the Hasidic movement, that even in your spiritual struggles, it's really God who is battling for you, which is an amazingly original idea.
Would you say that it's not so much courage as righteousness that is doing the battle? In other words, usually you think of raising an army to fight an amazing foe. The question is simply, how powerful are my soldiers? How courageous are they? It doesn't matter whether they're scoundrels, whether they're mercenaries. Their moral qualities are irrelevant. Whereas here it seems to be saying, I don't care how courageous you are. I don't care how big your muscles are. If you're not righteous, and if you don't know the meaning of prayer, you're not going to win.
It's certainly true that there's the tradition that the Jews fasted on the day of that battle. In other words, obviously, if you're talking about physical strength, that's like the worst thing you could do.
It's consonant with this idea that it is the enemy within.
Yeah,
and the enemy within is generally, you don't do too well with just courage, courage and strength. The battle is very much one of righteousness.
And I think it's also something that is antithetical to the contemporary spirit, which is that this story is saying you are not alone. So much of modernity is constructed around isolation, aloneness. I'm alone. So much of modern fiction is constructed around that, right? Me in my moment, in my, atomized Joycean moment. And what you have here is this idea of no, you're not alone. In fact, there's this tremendous interconnected web between the human being and what's outside the human being. Something that I wish we talked about more in public discourse in Judaism that you are connected and there is a very powerful bond between you and the Creator, but it's something that a person has to feel is there and has to work towards getting to. It's not just a kind of myth.
Ironically, Alcoholics Anonymous has come up with the idea.
Yes.
In terms of Alcoholics Anonymous, why is it so difficult, even in that context, to latch on to God as the thing that will bring about the cure? In a sense, isn't that really the very content of the embarrassment of being an addict, for example? Is that I can't possibly confess that the only way that I can get myself out of this pit is by praying to God. I mean, that's a horribly embarrassing situation.
People like to feel they're in control. And to surrender yourself to a higher power and say, I am helpless and I am reliant on you, is a difficult thing for people to do, but that really is the religious stance.
I think it's one of the great tricks of life, actually, to focus on the idea of self-empowerment, which is important, to feel like you have dignity as a person and you have the capability of changing your life. But to recognize that those capabilities also have limits and borders and boundaries, and that it is not an embarrassment, it is not a kind of archaic, unsophisticated thing to do, to reach out and try and fuse with one's Creator. And of course, that's what's happened in modernity, is that leap has been seen as the crutch of a loser. It's been seen as the kind of thing that somebody whose life is messed up, only such people would do that, or the person who needs certainty, right? It has lost any kind of legitimacy. But the irony is, who's fooling who here, right? The idea of sort of reveling in my own isolation and feeling sophisticated about it because I don't have to reach out for anybody ends up, to my mind, being self-defeating, even if it's philosophically cogent.
It's funny, I read a lot of Emmanuel Levinas, a Jewish philosopher who died recently, and he calls Judaism a religion for adults. That's sort of his catchphrase, the religion for adults. And it seems to me that what is being said here is that there's lots of room to think of Judaism as a religion for the childlike. That if we're too adult, what do we need God the Father anymore? What do we, if we're really so convinced that we can beat up Amalek ourselves, what do we need Moses standing on the mountain for? And isn't that, in fact, the worst delusion?
To be a child is not juvenile.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, you can be a grown-up, but still be a child to your father.
Right. And it's a deep thing. I mean, what are the characteristics that a child brings into the world? A certain sense of unjadedness, curiosity, wonder. In other words, a quest for knowing, and a quest for understanding, and a quest for belonging. And these are things that, actually, if adults got their act together in this way, the world would be far better off.
What do you think of, picking up on an earlier question, but there's a specific verse, 17:13, describes Joshua, who is the general leading the army in this situation, as weakening. The word chalash is used, that he weakened the army of Amalek. He doesn't destroy the army. Even weakening is a funny term. How do you weaken an entire army? I wonder what you think of this word, chalash, here, to weaken. And why in particular is it not given to Joshua to destroy Amalek there and then? Is that a failing on the part of Joshua and the army and the people? Is that a failing on the part of God, or a plan on the part of God that Amalek shouldn't be destroyed there and then?
Yeah, I think that the battle against evil has to continue in all generations. There can't be a sense of finishing. Nachmanides says in his commentary that the role that Joshua played and the role that Moses played is repeated through history, and ultimately in the Messianic age, this will be the role that will be played by Elijah the prophet as the leader in prayer, and Messiah of Joseph as leader in the ultimate battle against Amalek. But this is repeated from generation to generation. Joshua can only set them back temporarily, but the battle continues. In the mystical tradition, when we fight Amalek, we weaken globally the root of evil. And that is something which is of great benefit to the entire world. When we attack evil at one spot, evil globally is weakened. And God derives tremendous pleasure in that. And therefore the battle continues. Sometimes it's the battle is even more important than the ultimate victory. It's the fighting evil which is more important than the absence of evil. After all, if God wanted a world without evil, he could have created a world without evil. The potential for evil was created because God wants us to be virtuous in our battling evil. And therefore the battle has to be perpetuated.
It seems God really wants us to be warriors.
Well, it's interesting. First of all,
Even Israel,
we here in this discourse
Israel,
are taking this word evil for granted. What's striking to me is how that word is not taken for granted, and its opposite, good, capital G, in contemporary life. If I can just tell you a mini Amalek story, I once asked a group of my high school students, if Hitler was standing in the room in front of you, would you shoot him dead? See, because I think this gets at the real immediacy of what that Amalekite moment would be like. Could you do your own little annihilation, and practically guiltless, since we're not even talking about an innocent here? And it was a hard sell. I mean, a few kids said,
"Oh yeah, unanimous response."
No, and it wasn't because intellectually it was difficult. Of course, he's terrible, but somebody else kill him. There was this feeling, and I can empathize with that. I mean, to really pull the trigger, that's a hard thing to do. That moment is a difficult moment. That was one problem. The other problem is even defining whether evil exists in the first place, because it's not just the wiping out of Amalek that makes people uncomfortable. It's the designation that comes prior to that. This is evil. That we even have such a designation in Judaism with a capital E, and that we do not feel ashamed to use it. That is also just as difficult to sell as even the notion of the action of the annihilation.
Do you mean that this person is evil? That's the difficult judgment?
This person, this nation...
I mean, to say that a person so completely embodies evil that they deserve to be dead rather than alive.
Right. We sort of slide in and out of the morally complex and the morally confused, and they look the same. We have trouble making judgments. There's a certain impotence in how we make judgments, probably as a reaction to a certain vision of religious coercion. I don't want you to tell me what to do. We live in liberal democracy, et cetera, but it's rendered us impotent.
But isn't that really a metaphor then for the entire Torah? Because what is the Torah if not dividing between good and evil, holy and profane, very sharply, well-defined, not in a nebulous way, but telling us exactly this is good and this is bad?
It's true. In real life, it turns out to be complex to carry out. There's another 19th century thinker, the Ketav Sofer, and he wrote that you can go to war against Amalek, but your motivation has to be pure. You can only kill him if you think that you're fighting a war for God, and that this is to kill somebody or someone who is going to war against God. And since in the corruption of the human heart it's hard to find such pure motivation, it reminds me of an earlier exegesis on the story of Pinchas, where also there was a figure who was seen kind of queasily, post-biblically, like, unless you're doing it for Pinchas's reason, you can't just start stabbing people. Here, too, the idea is pure in its original form, but once it enters into human history, there's a suspicion on the part of Jewish thinkers as to whether we can really carry this out in the way it should be carried out.
Would you define that as the essence of warriorhood? At least as the Torah conceives it. It's interesting to me that Joshua, who I believe is first named here, this is the first we hear of Joshua in chapter 17, ends up being the one who takes over immediately after the 5 books. So in a sense, the destiny of the Jews right after the Torah is defined by this moment. Joshua was the one who's initiated in this moment. So it almost paints us, well, not us, but it almost sets up Jewish history as a history of war. That it has to be, right from the beginning, it's going to be a history of warriorhood. And as you say, warriorhood is not necessarily being the bigger, tougher guy, but being the more righteous person, which makes the war very difficult. Are you righteous enough to remove the life of another human being? Have I just answered my own question?
I think so. I think so. But it was well done.
Thank you. Can I get some last words from each one of you on this, if you wish? Any last thoughts, last encapsulating thoughts of who Amalek is today? Does Amalek still remain with us? Has Amalek been wiped out?
I personally prefer
what do we have to
the Hasidic interpretation. I think that it becomes more and more difficult to think on the macro level. We're going to wipe out whole nations. But I think it's exceedingly useful for each person to say, goodness is not an automatic inheritance of being alive. It's very tough to be good. It means fighting battles every day, and that's part of another kind of myth we perpetuate in this culture, which is that, goodness is kind of a natural thing, you'll come to it, everybody's good. Well, no. You got to think about it a lot, you got to work on it, and that's what good religion does. It aids us in that quest.
Yeah, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that the real Amalek, the literal Amalek, has faded away. It's drifted into oblivion. So it might be that we're not going to fulfill this chapter in a literal sense. But again, the lesson of the chapter, that evil has to be battled, it has to be identified, it has to be defined, it has to be battled through the power of prayer, reliance on God, recognizing where our strength comes from. That's a timeless message.
And you don't take the Hasidic interpretation, I assume, so you see Amalek as somewhere out there.
Well, I think it's out there and in there. We have to recognize evil wherever it is.
It's out there because it's in there.
It's in there in somebody else.
That's the way we like to think of it.
And what do you see the military training as? What now? Now that military training begins to fight the battle of Amalek?
I think this is very important. Military training has to be in virtue. Too many wars since the Second World War have been fought in a technologically sophisticated way, but the cause has not been well defined. That's why I think the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, these were wars of questionable morality. The last good war, I guess, was the Second World War. And this is the problem, where the moral issue isn't well defined, then the act of engaging in war dehumanizes the soldier and eats his soul out. And this is why military service has lost its glamour, lost its honor. And I think that's something we have to be mindful of, that if we're going to wage war, our cause has to be just. It can't just be something to advance economic advantage or because of some vague political domino theory or the like. It has to be something which is just, the cause has to be true, and then the soldier who participates can feel that he's engaging in a noble act.
Of course, it works circularly because it takes us back to the original question, who defines what is the just?
And on that question, I would like to thank both of you very much for this profoundly enlightening political discussion. Thank you. The image of war and of warriorhood is certainly not foreign to the biblical text. The greatest heroes in the biblical text, as in other texts, are in fact warriors. The great Messiah of the Jews, King David, distinguished himself first of all as a warrior. In fact, Israel, Jacob, who is called Israel, is given that name precisely for being a warrior, somebody who fights with God. That's what Israel means. Where's the enemy? In the case of Amalek, very clearly the enemy is without, according to the biblical text. But as you've heard, there's also good reason to think of the enemy as within. Can you even defeat the enemy without having first defeated the enemy within? That's the really big question. Thank you for joining me, and please join me next week. Blessings and peace to you all. Passages or stretches of text in Scripture, as short as one verse or as long as a number of chapters. Passages are stories that teach, but passages are also what these verses and teachings must pass through, passageways, in order to be heard and learned by us.